Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on this 27th of November of 2024. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And we have lots of very interesting information that is coming these days from the Zaporizhzhia direction, starting with the statements of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Syrsky, who said that the Ukrainians are planning to start another offensive operation. And of course this is very interesting, and telling the truth, I believe that Ukrainians are going to start another adventure. The question is where exactly the Ukrainians are planning to start this adventure. And today we got very interesting videos from the territory of around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in the vicinity of Energodar. The main activity were taking place in the vicinity of the village by the name of Ilinka, which is located on the Ukrainian side of the Dnipro river, but if we can call this area as the Dnipro river. What is interesting, let's take a look at this video. So in this video we can see just the regular activity, the Russians were bombing and then attacking the Ukrainian temporary deployment points and edge positions, strongholds, fortifications, maybe the Ukrainian positions of the FPV drone operators. From the first view there is nothing special in this video, just regular activity, but I would like to point your attention during this video at the left corner. So the left side, as you can see, there is a grass. And telling the truth, if we take a look at the map, there should be water, the Dnipro river. But if we take a look at this map once again, there is no river at all. There is snow, there is a grass, and there is a surface. The surface, currently it's very difficult to understand the quality of this surface, but one thing I know for sure, that both sides, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians, have strongholds and defense lines like the Russians have, for example, in the area of the Zaporizhzhia direction, the vicinity of Robotina. Neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians have defense like, let's say, around the Avdiivka agglomeration or something like this. There is nothing here. There's nothing here, and there is just the snow, grass on the surface, and unknown quality of the surface. So regarding the words of Syrsky about possible offensive operation, you know that everything might happen in this direction. We know that Zelensky wanted a long time ago to return control over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and probably Ukraine attack in the direction of Kursk region has the purpose to take under control the territories and then to exchange them for a nuclear power plant. Nobody knows for sure, but something tells me that in the very near future, or it's better to say that sooner or later, we're gonna see activities exactly between the towns of Energodar with the Zaporizhzhia power plant and the village of Velyka, because exactly in this area the distance is shortest between two banks, if we can call these two territories banks, because there are no more river at all. And I'll remind you, maybe you don't know, that before the creation of this water reservoir there was a road. There was a road exactly between the town of Energodar and the village of Velyka, and that road were moving exactly along this line. So as for now, as for the 27th of November, there are no barriers both for the Russians and the Ukrainians to begin offensive operation somewhere in this direction. Anyway, let's wait and see. And if the operation is going to start, obviously when the temperature will go deep below zero, when they're going to be very cold, when the surface would be freeze for several meters above, then there's going to be possibilities to begin doing anything. Now let's move further. As for the Zaporizhzhia direction, we have clashes on the ground and we have changes on the ground. In this video we can see how the Ukrainians were attacking and bombing the Russian forces along the road between the village of Nestyryanka and Orekhov. So we see that another day in a row the Russians are improving their positions. Currently it's very difficult to say what exactly the Russians are planning to do, as if you ask my opinion, I believe the Russians are maintaining the line of combat contact, they're maintaining the gray zone, because I believe that the Russians are expecting another Robotina offensive operation with the purpose, from Ukrainian side of course, with the purpose to attack in the direction of the city by the name of Tokmak. So the Ukrainians still believe they can do this, and maybe let's see what is going to be next. Now let's talk about the South Donetsk direction. Of course, the main activities are coming from the town of Velyka Novosilka. The Russians are advancing from the east, from the southwest, and many other directions. And during the previous 24 hours, we have some changes on the ground. The Russians improved their positions to the south of Novodarivka. In this video, we can see the Ukrainian drone that was filming the Russian edge positions, and then the Ukrainians were bombing the Russians. This video took place exactly in this point, and based on this video we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. And we have another changes on the ground, and as I understand, the Russians continue using their favorite outflanking maneuver. And according to information we have, the Russians began offensive operation to the east of the village by the name of Rovnopol, in the direction of the river by the name of Mokry Yaly. So something like this is Russians are trying to carry out right now, and the main purpose of this attack is to get as close as possible to the river itself, to take the strategical heights, and to force the Ukrainians to fall back in the northern direction. So the Russians entered the southeastern part of Velyka Novosilka, but to achieve better results, better positions, the Russians need to begin advancing not just from the southeast. The Russians need to take under control everything that goes along this red line. This is the perfect situation for the Russians to continue advancing in the direction of the town itself, and so that's why, as you can see, there's still a lot of job to do for this. We're not saying that the Russians are going to storm the towns and the villages along the Mokry Yaly river in front. Most likely the Russians will try to outflank every single village and to force the Ukrainians to fall back, but this is exactly what is going to happen during the next several days. Once again, we start receiving changes on the ground already on the territory of Velyka Novosilka itself. This is the situation on the ground by the end of the 26th of November. This is by the end of the 27th of November. Furthermore, I would like to add that these are the changes on the ground somewhere by the mid of the 27th of November. I believe that by the end of the 27th of November, the Russians managed to advance much deeper inside of the village itself, town itself. Now let's move further. We have very interesting updates on the line between Razdolna and Konstantinopolskaya. The Russians during the previous several days managed to take the village of Razdolna under complete control, and the Russians didn't continue moving further in the western direction with the purpose to take under control this stronghold. First, the Russians decided to improve their flanks to the south and to the north of Razdolna. And we have changes on the ground that confirm this. So most likely the Russians are not planning to take the stronghold in frontal assault. They will try to outflank it and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. So this is something new, this is something interesting that the Russians began using exactly in the second part of 2024, outflanking everything that can be outflanked. Another important progress took place to the south of Constantinople. This information was confirmed both by pro-Ukrainian mappers and by neutral mappers. As you can see, the Russians began advancing from the village of Yasna Polyana in the northern direction. Now it's a very difficult, interesting question, whether the Russians are going to move further in the northern direction or the Russians are going to stop. If the Russians are able to move a bit further for several kilometers to the north, then the Russians will be able to establish complete control over the settlements like Razliv, Constantinople, Ulakl, and Zelenovka. And the main town in the village in this direction is Zelenovka. Exactly from this road, the Ukrainians have supply and support of their forces in the Uspienovka stronghold. If the Russians can cut this territory with at least with the work of sabotage and reconnaissance group, this can lead to very big problems for the Ukrainians in the Uspienovka stronghold. As for the Uspienovka stronghold itself, I believe we can start counting days because lots of mappers during the day reported that the Russians managed to secure the villages of Elizavetovka, Romanovka, and Ilinka completely. These three villages under complete Russian control. This information was provided us by different neutral mappers and by pro-Ukrainian mappers. The situation for the Ukrainians is very critical. It will take probably 1 or 2 days for the Russians to regroup, and then they will begin offensive operation in the direction of Veselый Gай and in the direction of the village by the name of Ganovka. And these clashes are going to take place probably by the end of this weekend, and probably somewhere on Saturday or Sunday of this week the Russians will start clashes or will enter the first streets of the Uspienovka stronghold itself. So the situation develops very fast. As for the town of Kurakhove and Dalnya, during the previous 24 hours we have lots of updates, lots of statements from pro-Ukrainian sources about the situation on the ground, that the Russians are advancing, that the Russians are breaking through the Ukrainian defense belt. But as for the real geolocations or videos, we haven't received anything, as if the situation was stabilized at least for 1 day for Ukrainians to finish regrouping. Now let's move to the northern Kurakhove direction. The Ukrainians are saying that the Russians are about to begin offensive operation in the direction of Stary Terny. Currently, the line of combat contact goes somewhere along this red red line. The Russians are getting closer and closer. Today, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the village of Nova Ilinka was captured and secured by the Russians completely. Most likely tomorrow or the day after, the Russians will tell us the same about the village of Berestki, and then the first attempts to attack the village of Stara Tirny is going to happen. It's very difficult to understand whether the Russians are able to advance in this direction or not, because to attack the village of Stara Tirny is very difficult. And something tells me that most likely the Russians are not going to do this. Most likely the Russians will outflank this territory by attacking the territories of the villages of Petropavlovka, the village of Shevchenka, and the village of Slavyanka. So I believe that this is the maneuver that the Russians are planning to conduct with the purpose to outflank and semi-encircle the village of Stara Tirny from the north, from the west, northwest, north, and northeast. Now we are coming to the most important direction to my mind. The Russians are so you know that the Russians still haven't finished the battle for Kurakhove. The Russians still haven't finished the battle for Velyka Novosilka. They've just started this battle. The Russians still haven't finished the battle for Uspienovka, and the Ukrainians need to keep resources for every single battle, for every single stronghold, and it's very difficult, of course. And I see that the Russians have launched probably the major offensive operation. It's going to be the Pokrovsk offensive operation, and we are talking about this square. I see that the Russians are moving here. Once again, I'll try to explain to you. The Russians' main target before taking under control the city of Pokrovsk is to take under control this pocket. As you can see, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 villages in this pocket, in this square, and most likely the Russians are going to move. And today we got first reports that the Russians began storm assault operation of the village of Pushkina, and after the fall of Pushkina, the Russians will move in the western direction, taking every single village one by one under control. So what is the value of this territory, and what are the benefits if the Russians are able to take this territory under complete control? First of all, the main benefits of this territory is the gap between these villages and the next defense belt of the armed forces of Ukraine. I'll remind you that currently the Ukrainians are holding their lines along the villages Lisovka, Zeleny, Shevchenka, Novotroitsk, Uspienovka, Novoalexandrovka, and many other different villages. And as you can see, there is a real gap, and very big gap, between this square and this yellow line. Let's try to calculate, for example, the distance between Novopavlovka and this village by the name of which is the village, this Yuzhная Street, Kurakhove, is around 7 kilometers. For example, the distance between Muravka and Kotlarovka is around 4 kilometers. The distance between Alexeyevka and the Russian possible positions in this pocket is around 8 kilometers. So very huge gap, and which will, if the Russians are able to take this territory in control, the Ukrainians most likely won't be able to counterattack. And from these positions, from these villages, the Russians will be able to take to establish complete artillery, mortar, FPV drone control over every single village along this yellow line. And while the Russians control the situation here, the main Russian forces and main regular Russian army will begin moving from the village of Novogrodovka in the direction of Lisovka, Dachinska, Zeleny, then Shevchenka. Shevchenka is very important town in this direction. By taking Shevchenka under control, the Russians will be able to secure their flanks and to establish fire and artillery control over the city of Pokrovsk. And after Shevchenka, the Russians will continue moving along this yellow line. So step by step, the Russians will secure this territory until the Russians reach the town of Novopavlovka. So this is the operation that the Russians are planning to conduct in the very near future. And for these purposes, during the previous months, after the fall of Selidova, after the fall of Novogrodovka, the Russians were improving their logistic, bringing headquarters, artillery positions, infrastructure as close as possible to these cities, like Novogrodovka and Selidova. And now, as I understand, everything is ready to move further in the western direction. This is very important. Probably this operation is much more important than the battle for Kurakhove itself, Velyka Novosilka itself, or the Zaporizhzhia direction, because if the Russians can carry carry out and complete this offensive operation, this special operation, this will lead to complete collapse of the armed forces of Ukraine, and the most important, by taking under control this territory, the Russians will be able to reach the Dnipro region, the border of the Dnipro region and the border of Donetsk region, and this is also a part of Russian, first the tasks of the special military operation. As for the changes on the ground, we can the changes and the dynamic of this direction also confirm our projections and probably our speculations about possible Russian movements in the western direction. Since the beginning of November, we see that the Russians were advancing, and as you can see, the biggest problem for the Russians was this dense network of the fortifications, but we see that the Russians, since the beginning of November, managed to take under control more than 50% of this complex, and the Russians are advancing further. So from this angle, from this zoom, we can see how the situation was changing every single day, and you can see that every single day the Russians were taking additional fields, additional tree lines, additional fortifications, additional strongholds, and they were moving further and further and further in the western direction. And obviously this is the main priority of the Russians at this stage of the special military operation. Let's wait and see what is going to happen there. Now let's move further. As for the Toretsk, we see that the Russians decided to stop this offensive completely. I believe that offensive was too expensive for the Russians. I believe they didn't expect that they will be forced to waste so many manpower and the material assets to take under control this territory, and they haven't managed to finish this. Maybe they will return back to this operation in several months, but obviously not now. The same story about the city of Chasiv Yar. The Russians made, since the beginning of this year, they made a lot of attempts to take under control the city of Chasiv Yar, but now we see that most likely this direction will be also, let's say, established on pause, and probably one of the reasons why the direction is Russians are going to stop and set on pause is the change of the commander of this direction. I'll remind you this very important thing that the recent commander of the South group of forces South that was responsible for this area was dismissed, and according to information we have, the commander of the group of forces that was taken under control the cities of Ugledar, Novomikhailivka, Konstantinovka, very experienced person who managed to create everything right now we see in front of our eyes, was adopted as the general, as the commander of the Siversk direction, and now he started working, and we've been discussing this for several days about the logistic, about massive missile strikes and many other things. So I believe that the Russians are going to to start the Siversk operation very soon, because they adopted very powerful, very smart general in this direction. As for the Kupiansk area, during the previous 24 hours, we got several updates that the Russians managed to answer the village of Zelyony Gai. At least that was stated by different mappers, by neutral and by pro-Russian mappers. A very interesting operation, and as I understand, the Russians are going to continue moving further in the western direction, also from the village of Koplanki in the west, from the village of Mesazharovka, Andreevka in the direction of Zelyony Gai. And the main purpose of the Russians in this area is to cut or to block the village of Barova from the Ukrainian forces that are located in this artillery pocket. From one side, the Russians are pushing along the river Voskol in the southern direction. On the other side, we see that the Russians began moving in the western direction. So the main purpose is to meet forces somewhere along this red line. This will lead it will force, first of all, the Ukrainians to abandon their positions from this pocket in the direction of Barova. On the other side, this will allow the Russians to create a very powerful, very strong and very big foothold along the river Voskol. And telling the truth, from this perspective, there is no need for the Russians even to move further in the southern direction, let's say to the city of Liman. From using this foothold, the Russians have all chances to cross the river Voskol and to begin moving further in the western direction, with the purpose to outflank the city of Kupiansk from the south, because the Russians have already begun outflanking of the Kupiansk agglomeration from the north. As for now, we are talking just about a very small foothold on this side, but obviously this foothold, the Ukrainians are not very pleased with this foothold. They need to keep forces, and they need to always keep an eye on this situation in this area. which of course, first of all, disturb attention and attract lots of soldiers there. As for the Sudzha direction, currently the Russians are in offensive state, and the main purpose for the Russians is to take the town of Sverdlikova under complete control. During the previous 24 hours, we have some changes on the ground. The Russians are getting closer and closer to the town of Sverdlikova itself. We have lots of videos of how the Ukrainians were repelling one by one another Russian attacks in this direction. Maybe the Ukrainians managed to do this, but we have changes on the ground that were confirmed by videos and the geolocations. So as for this area, summarizing everything, the Russians are attacking on the line Nikolaeva, Dareva, Sverdlikova. The Russians are trying to improve their positions to the east of Darina. The Russians are trying to finish the battle for Nizhny Klin and also to get as close as possible to Sverdlikova itself. The main purpose is to take everything inside of this red line. If the Russians are able to do this, then the Ukrainians in Sudzha will start suffering huge problems with logistics, because the main road, the Russians will be able to get as close as possible to the main supply and evacuation roads, which may lead to big problems and casualties among Ukrainian soldiers and servicemen. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.